Hello, this is Tony Heller from RealClimateScience.com. One of my neighbors has this sign which reads, "In this house we believe science is real." Another neighbor has this sign, "We believe in God the Father Almighty." Both signs are statements of religious faith, but the owner of this sign probably isn't aware of that. Science isn't about belief, it's about details. So let's look at some details, or lack thereof, from the National Snow and Ice Data Center. They show Arctic sea ice extent steadily declining since 1979. But if we look at the data in more detail from the Norwegian Met Office, we see something completely different. Over the last 15 years, there's been no trend in Arctic sea ice, and the 365-day mean is the highest it's been in 7 years. This graph is very misleading, and we might wonder why it began in 1979. According to the United Nations, the Arctic sea ice satellite record began in 1979. But the United Nations' own report from 1990 told a completely different story. In 1990, the United Nations said, "Satellite observations have been used to map sea ice extent routinely since the early 1970s. They also said that from 1972 to 1975, sea ice extent was significantly less. We can see this in the United Nations graph from 1990. This was 1979, which was the peak, but in 1974, sea ice extent was much lower. So the United Nations threw out all the inconvenient data from before 1979, and now they tell the public that it doesn't exist. Now let's look at why sea ice extent was so high in 1979. This graph shows temperatures at the capital of Iceland since the year 1900. You can see that 1979 was the coldest year on record. The warmest year was 1939, but 40 years of cooling led to a lot of sea ice in the Arctic. This graph was from the 1985 Department of Energy report, which was the predecessor to the United Nations report. It shows that sea ice extent during the 1950s was much lower than it was in the early 1970s. And then from the early 1970s until 1979, there was another large increase in the amount of ice. So by hiding all the inconvenient data before 1979, the National Snow and Ice Data Center and the United Nations are defrauding the public. In 1958, the New York Times discussed ice loss from the Arctic during the first half of the 20th century. They said the polar ice pack is 40% thinner and 12% less in area than it was a half century earlier. They predicted that the Arctic would be ice-free within a generation and that ships would sail over the North Pole. But between 1958 and 1970, the world cooled dramatically. By 1970, the United States and the Soviet Union were mounting large-scale investigations to determine why the Arctic climate was becoming more frigid, why parts of the Arctic sea ice had recently become ominously thicker, and whether the extent of that ice cover contributes to the onset of ice ages. In 1974, the National Center for Atmospheric Research showed that sharp cooling prior to 1970. But NASA has since made that cooling disappear. In 1958, the Arctic was rapidly melting, but by 1970, the ice was expanding very quickly. The only way this could have occurred is if Earth cooled dramatically between 1958 and 1970. The 1974 graph from the National Center for Atmospheric Research appears to be legitimate, but the current NASA graph does not match the historical record. The cooling didn't suit NASA's political agenda, so they simply erased it. Ice doesn't lie, but government climate scientists do. Now let's look at some details about the decline in sea ice during the 1980s and 1990s. Between 1988 and 1996, there was a sharp decrease in the amount of thick, old, multi-year ice. People have generally assumed that this was due to ice melting during the Arctic summer. But now we're going to look at some more details to see if that belief is accurate. This animation shows what the ice was doing every month from 1988 to 1996. What was actually happening is that the ice was flowing during the winter out of the Arctic basin and down the east coast of Greenland, where it melted in the North Atlantic Ocean. The ice did not melt in place in the Arctic basin. What happened was, during the winter, it was blown by the wind out into the North Atlantic. So if you see a lot of ice down the east coast of Greenland, that means the Arctic is losing a lot of ice. In yesterday's video, I posted this comparison map showing how sea ice extent was about the same as it was on the same date in 1995. And somebody posted this comment about that map. Jim O'Hara said he generally supported me, but did not like the 1995 to 2022 comparison. And the reason he didn't like it was because there was more ice in 1995 around Greenland than in 2022. But if you like Arctic sea ice, a lot of ice in eastern Greenland is actually a bad thing. It means that ice is flowing out of the Arctic. Details matter in science, and many academics don't seem to understand that. In 2009, Canada's leading Arctic expert said, "Multi-year Arctic ice is effectively gone." But that claim isn't true. About 30% of the ice in the Arctic Ocean has been around for more than 1 year. And there's been essentially no change since Canada's leading expert made that claim in the year 2009. As we've already seen, the earlier decline in old, thick Arctic sea ice was caused by ice blowing out of the Arctic during the winter, not summer melting. That trend, however, stopped about 13 years ago in 2009. Now let's look at some more misinformation from Canada's leading expert in 2009. Vast sheets of impenetrable multi-year ice which can reach 80 meters thick have for centuries blocked the path of ships through the Arctic. That sounds very dramatic. But in 1958, the New York Times rejected that superstition. They said, although the idea that a solid ice sheet covers the central Arctic has lingered stubbornly in the popular fancy, the northern cap of ice worn by our planet is actually a thin crust. On the whole, only about 7 feet or 2 meters thick. And that's the same as today. The ice around the North Pole is about 2 meters thick. The ice closer to Greenland and Canada is closer to 5 meters thick. Ships are getting stuck in the ice because people are listening to these fake experts. One of the truly great scientists of my lifetime was Richard Feynman. He said, "Science is the belief in the ignorance of the experts." People who put up signs like this in their yard which read, "In this house we believe science is real," probably have no understanding of what science is all about. Belief is a statement of religious faith, not scientific understanding. My faith is in God, not climate fraudsters like Michael Mann, Katharine Hayhoe, and Joe Biden. I appreciate all the miracles in my life every day, like Toto, Kyrie Caesar, Toki, and Upala. You can visit them all on the web at realclimatescience.com.